Tansi ni totomatik. This is Yaz Morgan, and this is Just Fem Things.
A quick content warning. The podcast today deals with police violence and racial hate speech. Thank you, listeners, for choosing this podcast while you're living your escapist fantasies, checking the expiration date on your lube, or warming your finest glue gun. The three of us here today, Chloe, she, her,
Kevin, he, him,
Waleed, he, him,
graduate students at X University, currently going through a name change formerly known as Ryerson University, sat down, or Zoomed down to be more precise, in the fall of 2021 to discuss objects of resistance and revenge. Acts of resistance have been the collective might of marginalized people for generations, and with every step forward, the next goal comes into sight, the work continues. Within these moments, we can focus on the objects that work alongside acts of resistance, taking revenge on institutions that some would call eternal, but we would call for the scrap heap.
Protests. Well, personally, I've never been to a protest. Surprise, surprise. Me sitting inside all day long, just reading the news.
You've never even done like a sit-in one at school or something?
No, I'm too lazy for even that, apparently. But yeah, I've never been to a protest. I've seen a couple. I've passed a couple. I lived in Ottawa for like a year and a half. While I was there, I saw a protest while driving. So, on a personal level, I've never really experienced it. And I guess what it means to me is just people getting up because they're tired of some sort of oppression, be it systematic or personal, and just voicing their concern to the people in charge.
That's interesting. I was feeling like I hadn't been to enough protests, but now that you say that you've never been to one, I feel a lot better.
Oh, really?
But, I mean, I grew up in Toronto, so I feel like there's always, quite often, protests happening. But also, I, for a while, went to school in Kingston, and the protests that happen in Kingston are always on, like, a much smaller scale. And it's often, like, my friends that would be involved in planning them and stuff. And so I think, like, the protests that happen in different cities are really interesting as well. The way that they operate is very different.
Sorry, how small scale were they? Were they, like, 5 people? Like my awesome protest?
Yeah, sometimes. Sometimes you just be standing like on the street corner, and there'd be like 20 of you, some signs, and you just stand there for like a couple hours or whatever. But sometimes they would be bigger. I just think that like compared to the ones I've been in Toronto, where they go down to Queen's Park or whatever, those often are quite big. Have you ever been to the ones in downtown Toronto, Kevin?
No, because you know what, of course I had to move in the middle of the pandemic, but until I moved, I was way out in the suburbs. My parents were not really people that saw the point or the benefit of protests much, so they were very inaccessible to me for the most part. So, you know, like a lot of my engagement with these causes was very much online rather than being able to go in sort of a physical way. I have been to a couple over the years, not as much as I would like to, but hopefully now that I'm in the city, that will change a little bit in the future.
This thought just occurred to me. Does one person standing with a sign at like an intersection count as a protest? Because I've seen that many times.
I think so. I think like if it's a visible form of resistance, then it for sure counts.
One person with a sign saying, I am kind of upset.
Yeah.
Is a protest. Indeed.
Revenge can be murky waters to find yourself in. Even settling on one definition can be harrowing. Is revenge the right tool for the job? How much is too much? What place does revenge have in justice? How do you know what needs to be destroyed and what could be salvaged, if anything? One conversation cannot possibly answer all these questions, but thoughtful engagement with these subjects make them seem less intimidating.
I feel like it's so interesting and terrifying because revenge has all these connotations that we may or may not want to associate with. Definitely, for me at least, it makes me think of like letting your anger take the better of you, or at least when I was younger, that's what it made me think of, and like doing something wrong in a way. But then as I've gotten older, I've really come around to the idea that justice, self-care, not necessarily like outbursts or something that's destructive, even if things sometimes do need to be broken down in order to be fixed, can also be good forms of revenge in addition. So I think like it's been a journey for me on the topic of revenge to like come to this place where it sometimes needs to be a little more forceful, but it also doesn't have to be.
Growing up, same thing with me. Your definition of revenge was sort of confined to the dictionary definition, and that is more or less taking, I guess, drastic action against someone or something or some organization that has wronged you in some way. And I'm sure we've all heard the saying, revenge is a dish best served cold, which basically means don't do it, because at the end, you're going to regret it. It's never worth it.
Yeah, I mean, I think also similar to what you guys were saying when I was thinking about revenge, like in my own personal life, it's often associated with like my relationships with other people. And so like enacting revenge is often like, what it means for me would just be like working on myself, like focusing on myself, maybe walking away, providing that kind of closure and healing on a personal level. But then I think when you move into thinking about broader issues, like ones that are associated with institutions and systemic problems that kind of sometimes need radical change, as Kevin was saying. Sometimes you need to break stuff in order to have productive and meaningful conversations.
This is the new era of revenge, everyone. It's self-improvement.
But I think there's definitely still a place for the more angry, the more forceful side of revenge. I think to the tearing down of the Egerton Ryerson statue shortly before we all started the school year, really, and like that, the conversation that event created about Canada's history and legacy and all of that stuff was, I think, a good tone for all of us to start on the school year with, because it was very be aware of where you are and what space you're taking up and what the meaning of these places are forward. And so I think sometimes breaking stuff is the answer.
I like that. I should go break some stuff now because I need answers. I need answers as to why tuition is too much. But that's veering off topic.
Cell phones are not the first thing you think of when you think of feminist objects. But if reflecting on the power dynamics in the relationships in your life, and yes, we do have relationships with our technology, is not feminist work, then I don't know what is. Observation, communication, and information are just some of the many worlds touched by cell phones. At protests, records of collective power circulate alongside evidence of police violence. A greater media landscape has allowed movements to extend beyond the communities directly impacted, further pressuring institutions to bend to our will. Can we turn the product of a corporation against the harms committed by its makers? Let us think of what we give our phones and what they give us.
And so one thing that I think is really interesting that I'd love to talk about is cell phones, especially because phones and technology in general has become such an intimate part of our lives, right? And many people who are going to protests are bringing cell phones with them and they are using them. What is the meaning of that? What is the relationship that's going on there and all that? There's been a lot of conversations in recent years about the effect that phones are having on us. And I think if we're on this theme of making explicit our relationships to objects, I think there's also definitely a place where we should talk about how those relationships can best serve us. And I think that cell phones are a really interesting point of contention for good and bad, because it allows us so much information and communication, but it also has such an impact on us, right? Like I know there's been a lot of conversation in recent years about a sort of, I don't know what it's called, but cell phone separation anxiety. And also on our physical bodies, our thumbs are tapping, our eyes are looking at screens, our neck and back are slouched down. Actually, speaking of, if you're listening to this podcast, I want you to check your posture right now.
I'm leaning back. I'm leaning back, by the way.
Please check your posture. It's important. And definitely, I know in the medical community, there has been whisperings, if not full out work on the impact that technology has had on our bodies.
We're all couch potatoes.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
No, especially in pandemic times.
If we're speaking specifically to protests here, sure, you can use a phone to maybe text your friends or talk to them and say, hey, we're organizing this sweet protest. Why don't you come on down? Your phone actually listens to that and sort of compiles data and sends it to whoever knows where. And lo and behold, before you know it, the police show up. They're there before you, standing there, doing the old baton tap onto their hands and, shaking their head saying, hey, surprise, surprise.
So I wanted to get into some of the things that are good and bad about bringing phones to protests. And one thing that I think, Waleed, that you mentioned was how communicative it is and how it's so much easier and faster and more widespread to organize these things, right? You can reach a lot of people really quickly and say, hey, we're doing this thing. This is the time. This is the place. I've definitely seen protest Facebook events.
For sure.
Yeah, I was thinking about that.
It feels like communication, I guess, is a double-edged sword. Sure, you can get a lot more people, but then, you know what? The more people you have at a protest, the more attention it's going to get, and the more attention it gets, the better. So I guess that's not necessarily a bad thing, but then at the same time, the more people at a protest and the more attention it gets means the more cops show up half the time, really, to perhaps put an end to things before they get started.
Yeah, I think it's really great. I think obviously there's drawbacks to it if we're talking about surveillance and that kind of personal safety, but I think the idea that you can reach a way bigger community than you would have been able to before. We live in an internet age. I've never known anything different really, but probably how could you possibly pass out enough pamphlets to get people to attend an event happening that day? We're so used to now just being able to get things to go viral in a way, you can pass
forward an image of a pamphlet to everyone instead of printing it out.
Exactly. I think that's really awesome. And I also think in an accessibility way too, people that can't actually go to the physical location for whatever reason often are able to access way more resources.
Could we zoom into a protest? It's if there's a protest halfway across the world, just get someone there to
live stream
get your
drone footage.
No, I definitely think that's happened. I'm sure Facebook and Instagram, you can probably find some.
I don't know, Kevin, what do you think?
I think you bring up an interesting point, because if you read a lot of personal stories from protests and movements going on a couple of decades ago, it was much more small community focused. It was people who knew each other, who organized together. But now you can hit everybody. And so maybe even though you've hit a wider array of people, there's maybe less depth to the planning, because it's more like a group of people plan it and then everyone else kind of shows up with their own ideas of what it is, rather than a small community who's maybe more intimate with each other doing this all together. And so there's definitely some trade-offs there. I would definitely say that, especially with the women's marches from a couple of years ago and the BLM marches more recently, the fact that they were so widespread across countries really helped them in terms of getting these very important demands out there and for institutions to start responding to them.
Montreal had this big one where there was 100,000 people went or something like that. Chloe is referring to the 2019 global climate strikes. In Montreal, approximately 500,000 people took to the streets demanding climate change action. And then being in Kingston, being able to see that kind of information and that footage come in so much quicker, it really motivated people to show up to our similar protest because, I don't know, there's momentum. There was this spirit of community, even though people aren't in the same place at all.
What about counter surveillance on the protester side, where you perhaps film a nasty deed being committed by a police officer and spread the word using your phone?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely allows accountability and lets people see exactly what's happening on the ground.
The more recent look at police institutions and how blameless some of their acts really go.
Protests are sites of raw and passionate emotion, often grief and rage. They are movements in every sense of the word. The events themselves can be so rife with collective emotion that they feel overwhelming. But there is also a physicality to attending protests. Protests ask us to put our bodies into a specific space, a space that often leads to bodily harm. It's important for us to consider the material aspects that might affect our experience, as well as the immaterial ones. To remain present, to be able to demonstrate our commitment and belief in a cause, it is important to prepare in such a way that future us is taken care of. In our discussion of protests, we also wanted to think about the little details that can get left behind, and how we can take care of ourselves, our bodies, and our community.
I was at this BLM protest in New York a few years ago, being there, the vibe, the energy, the volume, it was really interesting and impactful. And it was a really positive experience in terms of just being a part of this one big crowd. But yeah, it's a lot of walking, it's a lot of standing, it's a lot of tiring yourself out. It was the summertime, it's hot. It's a real trek, I will say.
Yeah, this idea that you should, wear comfortable shoes and, maybe bring Band-Aids, put your sunscreen on. A hat might hide your identity, but it's also going to keep your scalp safe from the sun. And maybe it's cold, maybe it's going to rain later. I mean, often so much work goes into the organizing of protests that they're not going to balk if it's bad weather. So you kind of just have to be prepared for whatever the day's going to look like.
I guess it depends on the protest. If it's a sort of sit-in type thing, then I think food is definitely one thing you want to think about versus a march.
Especially in case things escalate and stores decide to close, you want to be prepared for the city shutting down.
But I also think that there's definitely a space for, shut all this down. If they're getting that much attention, then that's the idea, Convenient protests don't often get as much stuff done.
Charge your cell phone.
Yeah,
bring the survivalist gear. Bring the energy bars. Bring water bottles. I mean, if it's going to get that far, you might as well pack accordingly, right? I mean, because who knows if you're going to end up trapped on some street surrounded by a bunch of angry police officers and you go okay, I have no food or water. Should have perhaps planned this more accordingly, brought some supplies.
Yeah.
Right. Also, maybe to relate it back to cell phones for a moment, but other people, definitely safety tip. It's always good to go to these things with other people, both for, just being there, mental health. It's better to have company at these types of things, and also safety reasons. And you want to communicate with those people, right? If you get separated, if you have an assigned meeting space, or something, if you get lost, meet at this place here, that type of thing. That also goes a long way in terms of safety. Forethought is important with protests particularly, but any outing, really, just sort of knowing where you're going, what you're doing, if, that information is available, which often I think it is now. What is the planned route of the protest? Where are they going to go? What are they going to do? And so then, okay, well, we're going from this end of the city to this end of the city. That's probably going to take a couple of hours. Now I can start to work with that.
When we were talking about cell phones and surveillance, we briefly touched on the reality of police brutality at protests. In thinking about how to best prepare for protests, how to take care of yourself and your community, it's definitely important to think about the danger that comes with police presence at protests. The Black Lives Matter protests had a huge online following and discourse surrounding it. There were a lot of conversations about how to protect yourself from tear gas and pepper spray and other projectiles. I know a lot of media outlets and nonprofits were getting involved in the conversation, advising people not to wear their contacts and to bring some sort of saline solution in case chemicals got into your eyes. We also had like culture and beauty websites that were publishing articles about the benefits of water-based skin products versus oil-based skin products in the context of protecting yourself at protests.
Oh yeah, there was a lot of Instagram accounts, if I remember correctly, dedicated to protest organizing and providing that kind of information to the general public.
I think it really shows a lot about how pervasive the conversation was, that you had beauty websites doing things in their own way, because it really shows me that this person thought about the conversation and then said, how can I contribute with my own expertise, and how can I push this cause in my own way, and went with that. And I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah, it is a fascinating intersection of different conversations. I mentioned wearing sunscreen a while back, and a lot of sunscreen is oil-based, which can trap tear gas and pepper spray in your skin, but otherwise you probably wouldn't think twice about wearing an oil-based sunscreen. So there's an aspect of protesting that requires this kind of research so that you can make these informed decisions in advance about your safety, especially considering you don't always know what to expect on the ground. I also saw this photo a while back. It was posted on the Justice for George NYC Instagram account, and it featured a figure with a cardboard sign taped on their back that read, I have supplies and first aid, and then it listed the supplies, which were like masks and gloves, water bottles, meal bars and snacks, saline for eyes, etc.
Cell phone charger.
Probably, yeah. And I think this photo just really emphasizes the community spirit of protests and the materiality of them. It's so important to be prepared to be able to bring these items for yourself to protect yourself. But I also think being able to spare some for others in need is such necessary work, especially if you're in the position where you can spare some of your own money to purchase these supplies for others. Signs are often the takeaways passerbys retain when witnessing a protest. If protests are the voice for the voiceless, then signs are the sentences of the collective speech. While signs can portray a variety of messages, they sometimes veer towards satire. Satire and protest signs exist at an intersection of political commentary, working through the issues you seek to change, and showing up for your community. For marginalized people, by utilizing humor for signs, we can try to move forward from the trauma of these problems and work towards addressing them. Allies can hold the voices that need uplifting over their heads. What place does levity have in such a serious subject?
Signs, man. When you type in protest on Google, the first thing that pops up is what? People with signs. And it got me thinking, hey, maybe signs are the poster boys or poster people of protests. Because, well, I don't want to say without signs there would be no protests. But a lot of the times, what really catches people's attention when passing by a protest, I guess this is my own personal experience with it. It's not so much the numbers, but like, if you're in a hurry or something and you see a very colorful and large sign with some really awesome message on it, you typically remember that as opposed to, I guess, the chants.
Yeah, what people are yelling at you as you cross them on the street.
Yeah, I don't listen to them because I feel kind of nervous. Like, why are you yelling at me? I didn't do anything wrong. But your sign is nice. I'll remember that.
See your sign.
I think signs are really interesting because they can often do a great job of distilling the purpose and the goal of protests into something short and easy to read. And so when, as you said, when you search up protests, you see a lot of signs. They often can just tell you right away what is going on here, why are we here, and their simplicity is always better, I think.
It is. I found some interesting signs. I just wish we could have recorded this all together so we could have looked at the pictures instead of me just reading them out. But I saw this really awesome sign. So the top was just written in Arabic, and at the bottom it said where is it here? Relax. It says McDonald's. I guess speaking to sort of the post 9/11 Arab phobia. Is that even a word? Islamophobia, though I don't want to confound Islam with a specific race here. So I guess Islamophobia for speaking in a broader context. Oh, here's the famous one. You guys have probably seen this image of I believe it is a woman in a winter coat with her little cardboard sign that says, "I am a little upset."
Do you know what protest that one's from?
I have no idea. It's just so famous at this point. I mean, people confound it with the Canadian protests, and I don't know if it is, but that's basically what it's become in pop culture. Like, it's like a meme, like Canadian protest, and they'll show this this picture of this woman with her little "I am a little upset" sign. And this one really struck me. This final one I found, and I couldn't find the context for it. I was trying to. And this is what it is. It's a guy holding a giant straw, and there's a sign taped to it, and it says, "This is the last straw." I was desperately trying to find what protest that is from, but I couldn't, unfortunately. I mean, I suppose given the meaning of it, he's upset with something. This is the last straw, meaning, this is it. I'm over the edge now.
I'm interested, Waleed. A lot of the signs you've brought up are like funny. Is that kind of do you think that it's more effective to have some sort of joke on a sign that kind of lands and permeates throughout culture better?
That is a good question. Relating it back to revenge, I took a course on satire in my undergrad, and typically satire and humor was kind of used as a weapon of the weak against the sort of strong or oppressors. So I thought maybe this is a sort of extension of that, where people they make a funny sign with a very short, concise, and humorous message, and they bring it to a protest, and that those signs typically become memorable because they're approaching a very, I guess, emotionally charged or dense or deep topic in a way that becomes sort of more accessible to people who may not understand the nitty-gritty of the meaning behind a protest. And it's sort of, humor really brings people together. They're like, haha, that's a joke, we can all laugh at it, right? So that's why I sort of found these really funny signs and shared them with you guys. Sorry.
So then I have to ask, is the fact that you were able to find these funny jokes, but you weren't able to figure out what protest that they were specific to, maybe mean that in some cases, like, the humor ended up detracting from the context?
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess if a sign like the last straw one, if you're not there and you haven't heard about it on the news, then you're probably not going to understand what it means. But stuff like the Arabic one, where it's like, relax, it says McDonald's, their meaning is a lot more clear.
Yeah, I think it's tricky too, because I think pictures of signs really lend themselves to like meme formatting, and the way that they provide some sort of like text that can then be like placed into any sort of joke in a completely different context.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So that's a really interesting point, Kevin, because I think that happens all the time. Like the woman holding the like, "I am a little bit upset" sign. It's like the image itself is like has been used so much in like meme culture that it would be like impossible to trace. Not impossible. I'm sure someone can trace its original origin, but I think like the way that things get distorted like that through pop culture on the internet is really fascinating and potentially troublesome. This poor woman, she's probably trying to get her point across, but now she's become a meme. Yeah. But do you think like bringing levity into a protest is more productive? Oh, that is a tough question. I think it depends, really. I mean, you didn't see much humor in the BLM protests or like the protests we had in Canada surrounding the whole residential school incidents.
because I guess humor in that case just wouldn't work, right? So it would depend on the kind of protest you're having. But even then, I have seen some humorous signs related to not specifically the residential school situation, but the sort of BLM ones that had to do with cops and the cops' relations with African American people. So they do exist, and I guess as to their impact, it's completely dependent on the person who is reading it. Maybe they won't enjoy that joke, or they'll think perhaps it's not exactly appropriate, which is completely fine and understandable. But I guess a person like me, on a personal note, I guess humor just helps me sort of contextualize a situation, which is why I was so sort of drawn to these one-liner funny signs.
I know I speak to a lot of marginalized people when I say humor is definitely a coping mechanism for the traumas of everyday life, and protests are definitely one outlet for that. And I do agree with Waleed. I think definitely for some people it works and some people it doesn't. But I have to think that some of those protest signs, they definitely come out of that place. This is my pain, and I'm gonna work with it rather than against it. And I'm sure a lot of protests come out of similar sentiments as well. And then I also have to mention, some of the less funny and more emotional signs and our relationships to them. Like I heard a lot of stories around signs in pride parades and some of the older years when pride was more of a protest than a parade. But it was a lot of stories of, well, me and my siblings or children or parents, we made these signs, calling for our freedom and our personhood together, and I'm bringing it to the protest. Maybe not necessarily everyone's going. And so even if it's just, a piece of Bristol board with some paint on it, it has a much deeper meaning and a much more emotional impact, even if it's not, the kind of quips that maybe tend to hit the top of Google.
I know I've talked a bit about more directly humorous signs, but there was another one I found really interesting because of how, I guess, stark the message was. So I found this one when I typed in feminist signs on Google, and I believe it was from the suffragette era, perhaps the 1920s and 30s. And it's this fairly big sign being carried by four women as they sort of march down the street. And it reads, "Nasty women to the polls." And I thought quite a lot about this one and what it meant. And I guess on the surface, it was a sign pointing to voter equality because, that's what the suffragette movement sort of centered on. And the women holding the sign were basically saying, give us the same voting rights as men. But then I really start to delve into it, specifically at that phrase, nasty women to the polls. And what occurred to me is perhaps this is a case of dry satire, sort of taking a derogatory term and owning it. This sort of idea of reclamation, reclaiming power by, I guess, flipping the script and saying, hey, you want to call us nasty women? Fine. We'll take that. We'll run with it and we'll throw it back in your face. And the more I thought about that, the more I was able to sort of relate to it on a personal level, because I remember growing up and going to sort of not an all brown high school, but it was predominantly brown with some African people. And when we would go out and play ball hockey against other schools, some of the insults flung our way when we were in the arena were, Kevin, you've probably heard this one before, Packy, or more specifically related to our religion, because we were all Muslim, right? And they would say things like terrorist or camel jockey, and what we did was sort of our own little protest, where I guess we became the signs, and we were like, yeah, fine, we're packy. Yeah, we're we're terrorists. As strange as that sounds, but that's what we did. We're terrorists. We're camel jockeys. And guess what? Look at the scoreboard, white boys. You just lost to a bunch of brown guys. You just lost to a bunch of terrorists. You just lost to a bunch of camel jockeys. So haha, joke's on you. And I really thought about this more, and I was like, did the suffragettes use this sort of strategy of reclamation and put it on their signs? And was this sort of common to subsequent movements of feminism?
I see what you mean. In my own life, I actually took the opposite approach to the type of stuff you're talking about. The white footballers took to calling me a monkey throughout most of high school, but rather than lean into it, I actually kind of ran away from it. And even now, years later, I really avoid things associated with monkeys. Reclamation can be a really good thing, but when you're confronted with these hurtful ideas, it can be really hard to take them in. But, in thinking about reclamation and the signs that you mentioned, I think something that's important to think about is whose feminism is it? Certainly in the evolution of feminism as we understand it, there's definitely been so much of an emphasis in more recent years on whose feminism, who gets to comment on whose feminism. If I was at a protest and, certain people came up and started to try and criticize me on one of the things I was saying, I would have to wonder whose place is it to say that, to me. Certainly, I remember a lot of women of color speaking out around the women's marches around how they were being treated differently than, some other people who were there, and how that relationship is still very much in contention. And those outlooks, those more conservative outlooks are still definitely hanging around these spaces and others. And it's still a struggle for people.
In wrapping up our conversation, we find ourselves returning to the institutions whose actions prompt these protests. Tear down the system is not just a phrase bandied about protests, it's a promise, calling attention to the ubiquity of oppressive systems that work against marginalized communities. While we talk about safety, the ugly truth is that protests aren't always safe, just as the circumstances that drive people to protest are often very unsafe. But the importance of showing up for the community action remains.
I was someone who did not have a lot of control over finances and my possessions and stuff until maybe a bit later in life than most people. And so when I did start having things that were more in my control, I started to cling to them a little more deeply. And those objects held a lot of meaning for me. And my cell phone was definitely one that I held on to. And it, like many of us, it has a lot of our life on it. It has a lot of our information. And so for all its uses, it is also getting things from us, not just in terms of being a product that we buy and pay for and having a lot of things on it that we buy and pay for, but also in terms of the information that it collects from us. It's a two-way street with something like a cell phone. I would say, technology, it doesn't function the same as a lot of other objects. And so it's important for all of us to take a look at our relationships with objects and wonder whether or not those relationships are serving us as best they can. It's easy to fall into the pattern of, oh, it's just a thing, it's fine, it's not a real relationship, as if it was a person. In reflecting on that, I would have to say there's always a need to make these relationships more explicit.
I guess speaking to the personal object that I described, signs, it really goes back to the humor behind it and satire. And like you said, Kevin, for a lot of minorities, humor is a way of coping with trauma. And I guess just seeing these humorous signs at a protest enables me to understand them on a more personal, connective level with the people who are protesting. Because At times, being honest, I don't necessarily understand why people are protesting, because I'm sort of caught up in my own personal life, doing things like school and work. And, going past these protests on the street, hearing all the yelling, yeah, at times you kind of don't want to stay there. But then you see the signs and you kind of get a deeper meaning or an understanding of what's really going on.
I think when I was thinking about my relationship to these objects and to process more generally, I was also just struck by, I'm a white cisgendered woman who grew up in Toronto in her middle class family. And I have a lot of privilege. And in that, what does that mean when I'm attending a protest? And if we're talking about personal safety and can I bring my cell phone? And therefore, am I able to document things that might put other people in more harm if they tried to document them? Or am I able to record parts of the protest so that people at home that maybe weren't able to attend for whatever reason are able to, hear the speeches that are being given? Because often they're quite powerful and moving, and it's really special to get to be part of the crowd, being able to still watch a recording of it.
I definitely think there's so much to be said about going to protests that fall outside your specific identity, especially if you hold more privilege, and to say, you know what, I am also here. This is how I'm using my privilege to go and help to aid this group. Not to do it for them, because of course, if you're a guest in someone else's space, you should be listening to their needs and their demands. But being there, supporting them, is definitely a very positive act.
Oh, that's really well articulated, Kevin. I think recognizing privilege and really listening to others in order to further change and empowerment is so necessary.
Guys, I have an idea. We should get together and tear something down. Tear down an institution, tear down a system. You know what? Let's go to the old arena I used to play hockey in, and we can tear that down and stick it to the white boys. Because you know what? I'm not Pakistani. I'm Sri Lankan, damn it. There's a difference.
There are a lot of institutions who really make a business, not to put your final point on it, of hurting people and taking profit off of people and their labor and their bodies. And protests are one tool that we have to say, no, we're not going to do this anymore. And this is not how it's going to be anymore. Sometimes there's resistance. Sometimes there's a lot of resistance. And that can be really scary and traumatizing for people. This is my way of saying safety first, whether you want to go to for all of you out there, if you want to go to a protest, if you're thinking about it, the first thing you should consider is it safe for you? Is it accessible for you? Think about these things before you go, because these questions are not always going to be easy answers when you're there. And so while protests are a great tool and they can get a lot done, you definitely need to consider your place in them, and sometimes not going and engaging the broader community, maybe over social media or promoting or helping with any of these things, could be a good use of your time too.